Motion controllers themselves have limited inputs in what we're able to do with them. Typically, you're limited to 2 face buttons, as well as a thumbstick, trigger, grip, and in some cases, a menu button. But this isn't always enough for all of our different games and applications. Fortunately, because we're dealing with VR, we can detect certain gestures or intent that the player is trying to do. One popular example of this is by detecting when a player is looking at the back of their hand and having a UI pop up. So in this tutorial, I'm going to show you how to do exactly just that. But before we go ahead and jump into this video, if you enjoy this tutorial and want to see more just like this one, be sure to like and subscribe button down below. With that, let's jump right into the video. Here we're going to be checking out the UI that will be able to pop up once we actually look at our hand in just the right way, since we want to only be able to pop up in certain situations, so that way it's not always in the way. I do want to note 2 things right now. One, the arrow that I set up for this tutorial to make this pop up. I'll talk about that a little bit more in the tutorial. Probably isn't in the best orientation. It probably should be pushed a little bit further back. The second thing is I did make this a little bit more sensitive just to make sure that this would work pretty well. So if you see it pop up or pop out accidentally, then that's probably why. It is because I made it a little bit more sensitive in order to make sure that it would work well. And I'll talk about in the tutorial as well how you can adjust those values as well. Since it's all based off of error tolerance, this is a 2-way thing. You both have to be looking at your hand, and your hand has to be pointed at your face as well. So it's a two-person thing, and you probably just saw it jump up there. So anyways, let's go ahead and check this out. So the way that works is we have an arrow that's pointing up this way. So if I go and point that back at my face, you can see we have the widget that pops up here. A little bit off-centered, but not too big of a deal there. And you can also see too, we also have a widget interaction that pops up in our right hand as well at the same time. And when I look away, then that pops away. If I look back at it, it pops back up. And same thing if I turn my hand away too. Hopefully that widget interaction is still showing up in the screen there. So anyways, that kind of gives you a general idea. And this widget is pretty basic, so all you do is press trigger and it just switches the text to pressed. I kept it fairly simple for this tutorial, just so you would have a very clear idea of how you could use this. You don't even need to use a widget specifically. You can also use this for inventory systems if you want like a bunch of spheres that are placed along your hand and you can just grab and pull things out as you would like. That's another really good use for something like this as well. So anyways, let's go ahead and jump into the tutorial and I can show you exactly how we create this whole pop-up system. Just before we jump into the player, we first need some kind of widget or other actor that we want to appear in our hand. In this case, I have a simple widget. I won't go into how to put together a widget in this tutorial. However, this one is very simple. It has a single button that says pressed once it is actually pressed. Once you have whatever it is that you will be using on your hand, you can go and close that and we can open up our player. In the player, we will attach a widget component to the left hand and set its widget class. In this case, I'll be using the widget that I've already shown you that has our single button that will change the text on it. Once we have that widget in place, we also need to make sure that this is in a pretty good rotation location for our player. As you can see, by default, our widget is pretty big. So I'm going to go and rotate this so that way it's a little bit more comfortable for our player to see, and then go and scale it down so that way it is a little bit more in our viewpoint. Once we have our widget in place, we also need to attach an arrow component to the left hand as well. Reason for this is we'll be using this arrow component in order to determine what direction our player's hand needs to be facing in order for us to trigger this UI. So whatever direction this arrow is pointing in is the direction that our face needs to be in order to actually trigger that. Last thing we're going to need is a widget interaction component on our right hand. As you can see, we already have a widget interaction component on this VR pawn. If you're using this one, first go ahead and make sure that show debug is true. Now, one more thing that I do want to note that I did forget initially when I was recording this content is you do want to make sure that your widget interaction component's trace channel is set to visibility, not 3D object. I'm not entirely sure why the default is 3D object. If you leave it at this point, what will actually end up happening is when you actually go to point at your widget, it's actually going to go through the widget and it's not going to detect that it's even there. You need to make sure that that trace channel is set to visibility so that way you're actually able to interact with that widget later on in this tutorial. Once you have the components attached, we can go ahead and jump into the event graph. The only event that we're going to need for this tutorial is we are going to need the tick event. So I'll go ahead and drop that in. We won't be dealing with this right now though. I'm just using it here so that way we know where to come back to here in a second. So just make sure you have that tick and set it aside for the time being. Before we jump into that, we're going to create a new function and I'm going to call this detect hand widget. What this is going to do is this function is going to detect when our hand is pointing at our face and our face is looking at our hand. Now the reason for this function is we're actually going to set up a two-way sort of detection system. We're going to both detect if our hand is oriented at our face in the orientation that we want, but we're also going to check to see if our face is oriented at our hand. The reason for this is if we only do one or the other, we may end up triggering that UI when we don't mean to. For example, if we're only checking if our hand is oriented at our face, we may have it down our side and just slightly angle it up at our face. And that can just be a little bit of an annoyance when we suddenly see our UI pop up out of the corner of our eye. This will just make the overall experience just a little bit better in my opinion. So that's why we're going to be creating this function and managing everything through here. In this function, we're going to grab two references, one to our arrow component, and the second one is going to be our camera component. Once we have each of these, we need to grab our arrow component, and we need two values from this. We need the forward vector. Then we also need to get the world location of our arrow as well. We're also going to need to get the world location of our camera as well. Once you have all this, we're going to start with our world locations. We're going to find a look at rotation going from our arrow's world location to our camera's world location, and this will give us an out rotator. Once we found this look at rotation, we're then also going to want to change this to a forward vector. This will give us a vector that we are able to easily use. So once we have both of these, we're now able to compare these and figure out if they are close in value. So to do this, I'm simply going to compare these by checking to see if they are nearly equal. Now at this point is where you may want to make some changes. I'm going to change this tolerance to 0.35. However, you may choose to change this to a different value depending on what you want to do. If you decide to decrease this value later on, then it'll actually make this a little bit more sensitive and needs to be a little bit more accurate for this UI to pop up. Whereas if we increase this value, it'll be a lot easier to get that UI to pop up. But on the other hand, it may end up popping up when we don't intend to do so, which is why I personally prefer to set this to 0.35. I find it's a very good starting spot if you're just looking to give it a bit of a test and see just how this pop-up UI will work. Before we can take this boolean, we'll first need to copy this code that we made up until this point. And we'll need to take this copied code and swap the references for both our arrow and our camera. Up until this point, we have only checked to see if our hand is oriented at our face. By swapping around these references, we'll now be checking to see if our face is looking back at our hand. This will, like I said earlier, prevent us from accidentally triggering it if our hand is pointed up at our face, but our face is not looking down at our hand. So now that we have both these booleans, we'll now need to AND these. If these are both true, then that means our face is looking down at our hand and our hand is oriented up at the face that we want. And then we'll need to return this. If you don't know how to do this, simply grab a return node and you can drag up this boolean in order to create a new node that we can use. And with that, that's everything that we need to do with this function. So we can go ahead and compile and save all of this and head back into our event graph. Back in our event graph, we'll head over to our tick and grab that new function that we had just made. And we're first going to call this function. Then we'll take this output boolean that we get from this function and pass that into a branch. Now using this branch, on true, we're going to first take our widget and set it to visible. I'll also go and set this to propagate to children, even though it really won't make a difference if you choose to or not propagate to children in this tutorial. Second thing we're going to want to do is we're going to want to grab our right hand widget interaction component, and we'll want to make sure that show debug is set to true. Since at this point our UI is now visible, we want to make sure that we're able to see what we're pointed at on our UI. Then in false, we're simply going to copy and duplicate all of this code that we just made. And we're going to instead set our visibility on our widget to false and make sure that our debug view is no longer visible. Before we can call our player all done, we first need to check and make sure that we are able to use our widget interaction component. By default, we won't be able to do this, so I'm going to grab our right trigger input action. If you don't find this up here, or you don't find this in your menu when you're trying to find this node, go up into your project settings, and then into the input tab. And in here, you're going to want to check under action mappings to see if you have any action mapping that's mapped to your right trigger. As you can see, I have a single input action here that's mapped to a bunch of our right triggers for various motion controllers, and that's what we're going to be using here. Then once we have our input action, on press, we're going to take our widget interaction component, and we're going to press pointer key on this widget interaction component. On released, we're going to take our widget interaction component again, and this time we're going to release pointer key. Then one more thing that we need to do to each of these is we need to make sure that each of these keys are set to left mouse button in order for this to work. And now that's our entire player all set up and ready to go. So we can go and close out of this, and by default in my level, our player automatically spawns in, but if you don't, go ahead and drop in your player and then make sure it's set to auto possess and auto receive input from player 0. Again, if you already have your player spawning in, you don't need to worry about this and you'll be just fine as is. And that's how we put together a very simple pop-up widget that pops up the moment that we look at our hand in the right orientation. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. If you did, be sure to like and subscribe button down below. And also I'll give a quick shout out to my Patreon supporters who you should see over here on the right hand side. And with that, I'll see you in the next reality.